Rome had to learn how to fight because it occupied an important trading crossroads on the river Tiber, and it was always skirmishing with envious neighbors. As early as 500 BC, Rome had an army of 6,000 men called a legion, from the Latin word meaning conscription. But this was a far cry from the professional Roman army that would later dominate the world.
They are citizen soldiers, they are part-time soldiers, they get recruited for the campaigning season, they leave their fields, their work, to go off and fight in the army. At the end of the campaign, they're back, bringing in the harvest, bringing in the vintage, ploughing the fields.
Every year, able-bodied Roman men were summoned by trumpet to report for enlistment. But not all men. Only landowners were trusted to fight for Rome because they had something to protect. Service was regarded as a duty and an honor, and a must for any Roman seeking political power.
The Roman people are reluctant to vote for people who cannot show their war wounds. There are many stories of people standing for politics in the forum, ripping their clothes to show their wounds, to demonstrate that they have fought for Rome in battle.
Romans had to provide their own armor and weapons, so the wealthiest, the officers, had a helmet, armor, a spear, a sword, and a shield, while the poorest, the front ranks, had no armor and had only slings and stones for weapons. The early Roman army was modeled on the Greeks, especially the basic tactical formation. The Greek army used the so-called phalanx, a tight-knit rolling infantry formation which came at the enemy like a forest of spears.
Your whole army lined up, facing forward in lines, and then the first few ranks would hold out their spears and their shields, and the army would move forward en masse. The object was to simply push aside the enemy and in the course of it kill as many as possible.
Rome's first major victory was against its old nemesis, the Etruscans, when Rome conquered the nearby city of Veii in 396 BC. But the Romans didn't have long to celebrate. 6 years later, they met an entirely new kind of enemy, when Celtic warriors from the north swept down upon Rome. The Celts were a people linked by language, culture, and a style of warfare. And Celtic tribes were spread across Europe, from Ireland to France and Switzerland. In 390 BC, a Celtic army thrashed the Roman legion and overran Rome.
The Celtic method of fighting was very disturbing to them. The Celts simply ran at you with hundreds and thousands of men, yelling, shouting, banging on metal objects, blowing their horns. They really terrified the Romans.
The Celts left the city only after the Romans bribed them with gold. This taught Rome a lesson. It needed to rethink its whole military strategy if it was to survive. And one way was through training. Roman soldiers had to go through the toughest training in the ancient world. There were 4 long, hard months of basic training, and anyone who couldn't stand the pace was either discharged or put on rations of foul-tasting barley until they got it right. Basic training began with marching. Soldiers had to be able to march more than 20 miles in 5 hours, carrying a full pack. In weapons training, recruits were given dummy swords, shields, and javelins that weighed twice as much as the real thing to build up their muscles.
The Romans, I think, in this early period, should really be seen as the Zulus of the Mediterranean world. They are a highly militarized society, and like the Zulus, they don't let their warriors have sex, so when they come into battle, they're very tough.
As the army grew, armor became standardized for all soldiers and provided by the state.
I'm wearing a male shirt for body protection, and you can see it's made of small individual pieces of metal which are fashioned into rings and then linked together. Its biggest advantage, of course, is to take slashing blows across. Because the mail links all sit together, if an enemy hit me with a sword in a slashing way, it would actually take the blow. The disadvantage of mail was that it doesn't, in fact, take a stabbing at all. If you stab through the mail, the point of the sword will actually pierce the rings.
Beginning in the 1st century AD, the Romans also used segmented plate armor, held together by leather straps. It was so much more complicated than mail armor that soldiers needed help to put it on.
You can see all the protections on the top rather than around the legs and things. And the reason for that is that when you've got the Celts fighting you with their long slashing swords, you needed all that protection up on the top rather than the bottom. It also gives you a chance to run.
The Roman helmet, gradually redesigned over the centuries, aimed to give maximum protection without blocking the senses.
You can see it's a round bowl protecting the top of my head. Round because it's got very good glancing blow action. A square helmet would take the blow, whereas a round helmet, the blow would glance off. Large cheek pieces to protect the side of my face, and a small neck guard at the back to actually take an overhand blow protecting the back of my neck. Now, obviously, you can see there's no covering on my face or on my ears, in fact. And the Romans decided that it was a lot better for a soldier to be able to see around him and hear orders, very vital in battle.
Further protection came from the Roman shield, smaller and round in early times, later developing into a bigger rectangular one. It was made of layers of wood glued together, bound and covered with leather and metal.
The thing about the Roman shield is it's curved, not flat like most shields of the time. This gives me protection all around my body. And if I'm coming at you in battle, it's not only a defensive weapon, it's an offensive weapon. I can smash you in the face, and then while you're off balance, draw the sword and in under your ribs.
When it came to offensive weapons, the first one the Roman soldier would use in battle was the javelin.
The great thing about the Roman javelin is, when you threw it, the enemy couldn't throw it back. These are delivered in volleys of hundreds. As they rain down, the hard iron tip will punch through the armour. The weight of the handle will bend this soft metal shank. It'll be useless, you can't throw it back. Your shield is useless, you're probably hurt, you're in big trouble.
But the weapon that won the empire and kept it was the Roman sword.
Once the javelins had been expended, the Roman legion would then move in with probably the most vicious of his weapons, the short sword, or gladius in Latin. Very much a close-quarter weapon. It's much shorter than you would envisage a sort of a medieval broadsword to be, because it actually is much shorter. It's designed with a very broad base, tapering to a very, very sharp point. Now, the idea of this weapon was purely to stab. The soldier was trained to actually stab into an enemy soldier, mainly in the stomach area, because, of course, there's no bone for it to actually get jammed in. And, of course, a quick stab and withdrawal will put him out of action one way or the other. Now, the soldier was trained not to use an overhand blow, but purely a stabbing action. In the modern way, a soldier uses the bayonet, really.
The thing about this Roman sword is it's shortened to the point, and it's used for stabbing rather than slashing.
The barbarians, their swords aren't like ours. They're long and broad, and it's all an ego trip on the battlefield, slashing around above their heads, all style, that's all it is.
And while they're doing that, it's up and under stabbing to the ribs, and so we make mincemeat of the barbarians.
The Roman army was ready to use their weapons and training to build an empire. And the first victims were their fellow Italians. The basic unit of the Roman army was the legion, and over time it became highly structured. Eventually the legion evolved into a unit of 4,800 soldiers. It was divided into 10 cohorts of 480 men each, which in turn contained 6 centuries, not 100 men as you might expect, but 80 soldiers. Each century had 10 groups of 8 men who shared a tent. The legionary commanders were usually political appointments, Roman noblemen doing service as they climbed the political ladder. Their military ability varied greatly, and so much of the real running of the army fell to the officers beneath them. The most famous of these was the centurion, in charge of a century of soldiers. As Rome's empire grew, centurions became career soldiers, working their way up through the ranks. Centurions usually had at least 15 years' experience. It was their job to train the men, discipline them, and lead them in battle.
Because they'd seen so many campaigns, they understood the traditions of the army. They knew how the army could actually solve particular problems which it might encounter in future campaigns. So they were very much the living essence of the Roman legions.
Well, I'm in the equipment of a Roman centurion. You can always immediately tell the centurion because his crest goes across his helmet. In this case, the crest is made of horsehair, though sometimes they were made of feathers. And if he'd been given military awards, you can see they're worn on a harness on the chest.
Centurions were career officers who took the term literally.
Centurions never had to retire. We find some cases of people over 80 still serving. So this, of course, helps to secure uniformity of standards and training and so on throughout the empire. You see careers of these centurions who've been all over the place in their very long lifetime.
Centurions could make a soldier's life hell. They demanded bribes to excuse soldiers from the less popular duties and used their vine staffs to deliver punishment. One centurion, Lucilius, was nicknamed "Give me another" for his practice of breaking his staff over soldiers' backs. He was later murdered by his own men. After its early defeat by Celtic warriors in 390 BC, the Roman army changed its battle tactics. It did away with the rigid phalanx formation it had borrowed from the Greeks and used smaller fighting units called maniples, or handfuls, highly maneuverable groups of less than 150 men.
This allowed the Roman army to operate more effectively, perhaps on rather rougher ground, but also it allowed them to move groups of soldiers around to the flanks and to the rear of enemy armies.
While the basis of the Roman army was its infantry, the foot soldier, each legion also had an attachment of up to 300 cavalry. The Romans were not natural horsemen, so they adapted tactics and gear from their enemies, including the Celts. One example was the military saddle.
The saddle on top of it is a very odd-looking beast to most people now. It doesn't look like a modern saddle at all. The most obvious feature are the four horns on it, and the four horns are there because of the thing that is obviously missing. There are no stirrups at all. The Romans didn't ride with stirrups. The saddle that developed after they'd fought with the Celts had these horns as a very significant feature. If you've got no stirrups, as I said, you can't lean out sideways very safely on a flat saddle. These horns enable you to do that. The saddle looks short compared to a modern saddle because the back horns press against your backside, the front horns go under your thigh, and you can lean out probably to about 45 degrees with relative safety.
Part of the cavalry's job was to harass the enemy, and the riders carried special light javelins for that purpose.
As you pass an enemy, you can lob several of them at them. They're not going to do a huge amount of damage, but your purpose isn't necessarily to do a lot of damage. It's to make the formation break up so that the infantry can get in and win.
In battle, the cavalry lined up on the wings of the legions. The infantry formed 3 horizontal lines so they could take turns at being the front line until the battle was won. As the Romans assembled to start the battle, they banged their swords against their shields in a frightening drum roll until the order came to charge. As the two sides closed in on each other, the Roman front lines would launch their javelins, disrupting the enemy formation. The infantry would form wedges to break up the enemy lines and allow close-in fighting. That was when the short Roman stabbing sword would come into its own.
The fighting itself might be only 20 minutes or so. Sometimes it was a lot longer, but it was very difficult to fight for a great length of time with this massive weight of armour that Roman soldiers and often their enemies wore. Part of the reason for Roman success in battle was undoubtedly to do with training.